The idea was to land about 1,400 Cuban exiles on a number of 3 beaches on the southern side of Cuba around the area of the Bay of Pigs. And it was never that these 1,400 men were then going to push into Cuba and defeat Castro's army of 25 or 30,000. The idea was that they were going to hold this beachhead for a week, maybe 10 days, and that simply by holding on to this beachhead, they could, first of all, give an incentive to any Cubans who didn't like Castro to come join them, to rise up against Castro, that it would be a spark for some internal revolution within Cuba. That would never have happened, but that was one hope.
How could they get to the beach?
Exactly. How could they get to the beach? But even if they were in other places, the problem is there weren't that many anti-Castro Cubans left in Cuba because they were all in Miami or they were in jail. I mean, there really weren't that many left.
And those that were in Cuba, Castro put in.
He put in even that. He rounded them up on the shortly before the invasion.
Yeah.
But the plan was so you hold this beachhead, hope that things happen internally in Cuba, and then you have a provisional government that's been assembled in Miami. You fly them in a few days in after you've got a hold of this beachhead, and they declare themselves the rightful leadership of Cuba. Now again, this might be an incentive to anti-Castro Cubans to come join the cause, but always in the plan from the beginning was the idea that then this government, this provisional government, could invite the United States government to come in overtly or quasi-overtly and help out, just give some aid. And this would be a foot in the door for the United States legally, without looking like they were just coming in to help some poor freedom fighters rather than themselves invading Cuba. And the idea that they could have held this beachhead, that too is not completely insane, because there was these beaches and then there was a vast swamp. And there were only 3 roads through this swamp. There was really no other way to get through the swamp other than take these 3 roads. And if you could hold those 3 roads, didn't matter how many people Castro had coming at you, you could have these chokeholds there and they couldn't get by. But this leads to the really big problem with what happened in the Bay of Pigs invasion. This all depended on Fidel Castro having no airplanes.
Yeah.
Because, and the plan always meant for these Cuban exile pilots to go in and destroy Castro's planes on the ground. And so this was done on April 15th, 2 days before the invasion, in a preliminary strike, and about half the planes were destroyed. But there were still 6, 7 planes left. And there was supposed to be a follow-up airstrike on the morning of April 17th that would take out the rest of Castro's Air Force. But on the night of April 16th, Kennedy canceled that follow-up airstrike. And to this day, this is what makes Cuban exiles, particularly those who were involved in this, despise Kennedy.
Why did he cancel it?
He canceled them for political reasons. After the first airstrikes, it became very apparent to the entire world that the United States was behind this. The CIA had come up with a few methods to try to avert attention and make it look like it was an internal Cuban event, but nobody bought those.
Like the guy who flew to...
Yeah, there's a guy who flew, he's actually flying from Nicaragua, but he pretended he was a Cuban, said that he'd flown from Cuba, he lands in Miami, claims that he and a number of other pilots in the Cuban Air Force that morning decided to rebel against Castro and bomb their own airfields. In fact, those airfields had been bombed by this fleet of American-purchased airplanes flown by Cuban exile pilots that had flown from Nicaragua and had bombed those airfields. But in any event, very quickly this whole ruse comes undone. And then it's often blamed on Adlai Stevenson. Poor Adlai Stevenson gets blamed for anything that went wrong in the Eisenhower, in the Kennedy administration.
Yeah.
He had been promised that there wasn't going to be anything like this happening. a General Assembly in the UN he's the ambassador to the UN for the United States. The General Assembly is just beginning, and he's caught unawares by this, and he writes a letter a cable to Dean Rusk saying, this is awful, these airstrikes. You've put me in a very awkward position. Later then it was blamed on Stevenson that that cable is why Kennedy canceled the second airstrike. Really, though, it was a whole number of things. Kennedy just realized the American hand is showing, and if we send another round of airstrikes, we're only going to escalate tensions that are already there. So he canceled them. But that was really the end of the invasion right then and there, even though the invasion hadn't even landed yet.
This excerpt is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law, a leader of reform in legal education and a leader in multimedia education for the public. To view the full interview and for a full listing of MSL's programs, log on to mslaw.edu.
Welcome.